January 1945. Clark Field, Luzon, the Philippines. Among the wreckage left behind by retreating Japanese forces, a team of U.S. Army Air Force engineers discovers something rare, an intact Mitsubishi G4M, the bomber Allied crews had come to know by a single name whispered with both respect and disbelief, Betty. To the Americans, the sight is surreal. The aircraft sits abandoned on the tarmac, its olive green paint scarred by sun and dust, yet its structure almost pristine. The engineers approach cautiously. This machine, once feared for its long range and deadly precision, now lies silent, a ghost of Japan's former reach across the Pacific. Major William McCoy, an experienced test pilot and engineer, circles the bomber slowly. He has read combat reports, heard stories from fighter squadrons, but none of them prepared him for what he sees now. A twin-engine bomber, slender and elegant, its fuselage stretched longer than any American medium bomber. It looks fast, almost fragile, more like a racing aircraft than a weapon of war. McCoy climbs the narrow ladder to the cockpit. The controls are compact, efficient, Japanese precision. But something else catches his eye as he moves toward the wings. The fuel system, massive tanks housed directly inside the wing structure, seem almost exposed. He checks again, then looks to his crew chief. There's no mistake. No armor. No rubber lining. No self-sealing protection. McCoy calls over his team. "Gentlemen," he says quietly, "take a look at this." They lean in. What they see defies every rule of combat aviation they've lived by. Unprotected fuel tanks. Thin aluminum skin. No insulation. One tracer hit, and this entire machine would ignite like paper. For a long moment, no one speaks. The engineers exchange glances. They all know what this means. This aircraft, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, was designed with no protection against fire. And yet, it had flown thousands of kilometers, deep across the Pacific, striking targets at distances no American bomber could match. McCoy shakes his head, puzzled. "This doesn't make sense," he mutters. He opens a maintenance panel, tracing fuel lines with his hand. Every joint, every seal, immaculate Japanese craftsmanship. But nothing between the fuel and the sky outside. Nothing at all. Outside the hangar, the afternoon sun beats down on the airfield where wrecked Zero fighters and shattered hangars mark the chaos of retreat. The team photographs every detail, the engines, the fuselage, the wings. They know Washington will want answers. How could a nation known for its meticulous engineering send pilots to war in an aircraft so fatally exposed? The truth, they will soon learn, lies in a choice made 8 years earlier, in 1937, when Japan's Navy demanded an aircraft capable of reaching targets over 6,000 kilometers away. A bomber that could strike from island bases with no refueling, no escorts, and return home on its own. That impossible demand shaped everything about the G4M, including its deadly flaw. Back in Japan, Mitsubishi's engineers had wrestled with the problem of range. Every extra kilogram meant less distance. Armor was heavy. Self-sealing tanks added hundreds of pounds. So they made a choice, sacrifice protection for performance. Every kilogram saved meant more fuel, and every liter of fuel meant more reach. Thus, the Betty was born, beautiful, deadly, and doomed. In its first years, the decision seemed vindicated. December 1941, G4M bombers strike at Clark Field, destroying American aircraft on the ground in the opening hours of the Pacific War. They fly farther, faster, and hit harder than anyone thought possible. The range gives Japan the illusion of invincibility. But the illusion will not last. By 1942, American fighter strength begins to grow. And with it, the Betty's fatal weakness becomes clear. Every bullet that pierces its thin skin ignites fuel. Every tracer round turns the sky into fire. Allied pilots describe watching Bettys burst into flames after a single hit, vanishing in seconds, no parachutes, no survivors. To the Japanese, the aircraft's range was its pride. To the Americans, it became a symbol of fragility, a flying torch. But in early 1945, at Clark Field, as McCoy's team examines tail number 763-12, the realization finally sets in. This wasn't a mistake. It was a philosophy. A choice so absolute it defined the war for those who flew it. McCoy closes his notebook, staring through the cockpit glass at the horizon where the Pacific glimmers faintly beyond the wreckage. He understands what the data can't show, that men once climbed into this machine knowing one hit could erase them. They flew anyway. Because duty demanded it. Because there was no other way. As the sun sinks behind the ruined airfield, the Betty stands silent, its unprotected tanks glinting faintly through bullet holes and dust. For the Americans, it is an engineering mystery. For the Japanese, it was a death sentence written in aluminum. And for history, it will become one of the most haunting symbols of the Pacific War, an aircraft that could fly anywhere, but rarely return. As engineers at Clark Field documented every inch of the captured Betty, intelligence officers began piecing together the aircraft's history, how a bomber once hailed as a marvel of range and design had become the most fragile weapon in Japan's arsenal. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became, the Betty's destruction was not random. It was mathematical. Predictable. Built into its very frame. All military operations carried casualties, but the Betty's losses were staggering. Far beyond projections, far beyond tolerance. Its unprotected fuel tanks, the same design feature that gave it an extraordinary 6,000-kilometer range, also sealed its fate. Every hit to the wings or fuselage was catastrophic. There were no wounded Bettys limping home. No damaged aircraft saved by armor or sealing compound. Each engagement ended one of two ways: the bomber returned untouched, or it vanished in fire. By mid-1943, even Japan's engineers could no longer ignore the numbers. Entire squadrons erased in a single mission. Crews burned alive in aircraft that offered them no chance of survival. In March 1943, a change began. Starting with the 663rd aircraft produced, Mitsubishi introduced a new measure: 30mm rubber sheets installed beneath the wings, where the fuel tank sat. They were not true self-sealing tanks, merely a compromise, an attempt to buy seconds of time before disaster. The modification worked, but only barely. The added protection slowed fuel leaks from small-caliber hits. Against cannon shells or tracer rounds, it was useless. Fires still erupted. Aircraft still exploded. The numbers told a grim truth. Top speed fell by 9 km per hour. Maximum range dropped by 315 kilometers. And yet, crew survival showed no measurable improvement. Japan had traded performance for a false sense of hope, and lost both. Engineers pushed further. In October 1944, they introduced the G4M Model 3, featuring true self-sealing tanks, finally, real protection. But to fit the material, fuel capacity was reduced to 4,490 liters. Range dropped to just 3,640 kilometers, more than 2,000 less than the original. Only about 60 Model 3s were ever built before the war's end. Too few. Too late. By 1944, the skies belonged to the Americans. No level of protection could save the Betty now. The bomber's once legendary range had become meaningless in a sky ruled by radar and P-38 lightnings. And it was one of those lightnings that would soon turn the Betty into the stage for one of the Pacific War's most decisive moments. April 18, 1943. The Solomon Islands. American codebreakers intercept a transmission. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, will be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville. His transport, a G4M Betty bomber. The Americans prepare an interception that will test every limit of precision and nerve. 18 P-38 Lightnings of the 339th Fighter Squadron are assigned to the mission. Only 16 make it airborne, one loses a tire on takeoff, another suffers drop tank failure. But the plan goes forward. Their task is near impossible. To intercept Yamamoto's bomber over 400 miles of open ocean, without radar, without landmarks, flying barely 50 feet above the waves to avoid detection. One error in navigation, one miscalculation in time, and the mission will fail. At 7:25 hours, the P-38s depart Guadalcanal. Radio silence. Dead reckoning only. The formation holds steady over the endless Pacific, the pilots watching their fuel, their clocks, their compass needles. Every man aware that precision is life. At 9:34 hours, exactly 1 minute ahead of schedule, the lead pilot spots movement against the horizon, 2 Betty bombers, low and steady, escorted by 6 fighters. The intercept point is perfect. The trap has closed. Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber break formation. Lanfear swings high to draw off the zeros. Barber dives low, lining up on the lead bomber, Yamamoto's plane. The Betty takes hits instantly, cannon fire rips into the right wing, where the unprotected fuel tanks lie exposed. Flames erupt across the wing. The bomber rolls violently, trailing smoke and fire before plunging into the jungle below. It explodes on impact. Hours later, Yamamoto's body is recovered, his hand still clutching his sword. The aircraft's vulnerability had sealed his fate. The second Betty is also destroyed, crashing into the jungle minutes later. No survivors. For the Americans, the mission is a triumph, proof of their precision, intelligence, and control. For the Japanese, it is a tragedy layered in irony. The very bomber that carried Yamamoto, the man who envisioned Japan's reach across the Pacific, becomes the weapon that burns beneath him. From this moment onward, the Betty's reputation is no longer that of a long-range marvel, but of a flying coffin. Crews nickname it Hamaki, the cigar, for its shape, and the way it burns. Yet Japan continues to use it. Because there is no alternative. Because despite the flames, despite the fear, it remains the only aircraft capable of reaching the distant front still holding out against American forces. Every sortie becomes a gamble against physics and fate. Every mission begins with the same prayer, that no bullet finds the wings. For most, those prayers go unanswered. By early 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned. American bombers were everywhere, B-24s sweeping across the islands, B-29s rising over the horizon. For Japan, the skies that once represented power now symbolized loss. And still, the G4M Betty remained in service, thin-skinned, outdated, and doomed. Every mission sent in a Betty was a question of endurance. Could it make it to target and back before the inevitable spark found its fuel? Crews knew the odds. They saw the wreckage that littered runways after raids. But they also knew Japan had nothing else that could reach so far. In desperation, the Imperial Navy began turning the Betty into something else, not a bomber, but a delivery system. Not for bombs, but for pilots willing to die. In the final year of the war, Japan developed a weapon unlike any before, the Yokosuka MXY-7 Ohka, or Cherry Blossom. A rocket-powered, manned suicide bomb designed to be carried to its target by a Betty bomber. Once in range, the Ohka pilot would detach, ignite his rockets, and dive directly into Allied ships. It was a desperate invention, born from defeat, fueled by faith. But it required one thing above all, range. And so, once again, the task fell to the Betty. Each Ohka was slung beneath the bomber's fuselage, forcing the Betty to fly slow and low. It could no longer maneuver. It could no longer defend itself. Every mission became a slow procession toward destruction. American pilots soon learned what the sight of a Betty with an Ohka meant, and they made those aircraft their highest priority. They called the Betty-Ohka combinations Baka bombs, from the Japanese word for fool. But for the men inside, there was nothing foolish about their mission. To them, it was duty. A final offering to a dying empire. On March 21, 1945, the first operational Ohka mission was launched. 18 Betty bombers, each carrying one Ohka, took off from Kanoya Air Base in Kyushu, bound for the American fleet near Okinawa. They never made it. Before the formation could reach its target, American fighters intercepted them. The Bettys, weighed down and vulnerable, stood no chance. 17 were shot down within minutes. Only one managed to return to base. The results were catastrophic. Hundreds of trained airmen, lost in an instant. The weapon designed to deliver the Empire's vengeance had instead delivered its futility. Still, Japan pressed on. The second Ohka mission, on April 1st, ended the same way, destroyed before reaching target. The third mission, on April 12th, finally made contact. One Ohka hit the destroyer USS Manard L. Cable, splitting it in two. It was the first ship ever sunk by a rocket-powered manned aircraft. But victory was short-lived. For every ship damaged, 20 Bettys were lost. By May 1945, Japan's supply of trained bomber crews had collapsed. American intelligence intercepted radio chatter describing Betty squadrons launching with prayers over open channels, crews bidding farewell before even leaving the runway. The tone was solemn, calm, almost ritual. They no longer expected to return. By the summer of 1945, the Betty was no longer a bomber. It was a symbol of endurance, of tragedy, of an empire's refusal to surrender even when defeat was absolute. In the closing weeks of the war, the surviving G4MS were scattered across the Japanese home islands, grounded, out of fuel, or waiting for orders that would never come. But the Betty's story was not over yet. It would play one final role, not as a weapon, but as a messenger of peace. August 14, 1945. Japan announces its intention to surrender. Across the Pacific, battles cease. Gunfire fades. The air is quiet for the first time in years. And on August 19, 1945, a strange sight appears in the sky above Ie Shima, an airfield near Okinawa. Two Japanese Betty bombers, painted pure white with green crosses on their fuselage and wings, the universal symbol of truce. They are unarmed. Unescorted. Inside are Japanese envoys carrying surrender documents and orders from Tokyo to meet with Allied representatives. The very aircraft once feared for its range and firepower now flies as a vessel of surrender. As they land, American soldiers stand ready, weapons lowered, watching in disbelief. For years, the sight of a Betty meant death. Now, it means the end of war. The envoys disembark, their expressions solemn but calm. They bow, and are escorted to waiting vehicles that will take them to meet General Douglas MacArthur's staff. The aircraft that once carried destruction now carries peace. The symbolism is haunting. The Betty, the same machine that burned across the Pacific, that carried Yamamoto to his death, that delivered suicide pilots toward their final mission, has become the bearer of surrender. For American pilots watching from the runway, the moment is surreal. They remember the flames, the dogfights, the endless reports of Bettys lost in fire. And now, two of them sit silent on an Allied airfield, their engines cooling under the Okinawan sun. The war that began in smoke and fire ends in silence and dust. The Betty, stripped of bombs and blood, finally fulfills a purpose that costs no lives. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was a graveyard of aircraft. B-29s lined the runways of Tinian. Corsairs and Hellcats sat idle on carriers. And across the Japanese islands lay the rusting carcasses of what had once been the pride of the Imperial Navy, the Mitsubishi G4M Betty. For American forces, the war's end marked the beginning of a new mission, understanding the enemy's machines. Every captured aircraft, every engine, every bullet hole told a story. And among them, none provoked more curiosity, or confusion, than the Betty. At Clark Field in the Philippines, engineers and intelligence officers assembled around a captured G4M Betty, one of the few still intact enough to fly. It had been seized during the final months of the war, a ghost of the Pacific air battles now sitting quietly under the tropical sun. Its faded Hinomaru markings were still visible, its green paint chipped and pitted from salt air. The once deadly bomber looked fragile up close, too thin, too light, too vulnerable. And that was exactly what baffled the Americans. To their eyes, the Betty was a contradiction. Here was a bomber that had stunned Allied intelligence with its range and speed, yet it lacked the most basic protection any American design would never fly without. No armor plating. No self-sealing fuel tanks. A single burst from a .50 caliber machine gun could ignite the entire aircraft. Colonel Ralph Larson, one of the U.S. Army Air Force's technical officers stationed at Clark, later wrote, "The Japanese seemed to have built this plane with the faith that it would never be hit. It was fast, yes. But it burned like paper." When the team began inspecting the wings, they realized why. Instead of the heavy, layered structure used in American bombers, the Betty's wings were paper-thin aluminum shells surrounding vast fuel tanks. Fuel tanks so large, they filled nearly half the wing's volume. There were no self-sealing liners, just bare aluminum and rivets. Even the fuel lines were exposed, unarmored, snaking through the fuselage. One spark, from gunfire, friction, or static, and the entire system became a torch. Engineers ran tests, firing controlled rounds into the captured bomber's wings. Every time, the results were identical, a flash, then fire, then nothing but smoke. One engineer simply shook his head. "This plane shouldn't have survived a single mission," he muttered. Yet it had. Thousands of missions, in fact. And for a time, it had terrorized Allied ships across the Pacific. That paradox, how something so fragile could be so feared, became the mystery American intelligence wanted to solve. In the following weeks, they dismantled several captured Bettys piece by piece. Each component was catalogued, weighed, and analyzed. Every detail pointed to a single truth: the G4M was designed with one purpose: range. In the Pacific, distances were everything. From Japan to Rabaul, from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, the Empire's battle lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. To reach those targets, Japan needed a bomber that could fly farther than any Allied aircraft. And to achieve that, every ounce of unnecessary weight had to go. Armor, self-sealing tanks, reinforced fuselage, all of it was sacrificed for fuel capacity. The result was a bomber that could fly 3,000 miles without refueling, but couldn't survive a single bullet. As one American analyst summarized in his report, the G4M was a triumph of range and a failure of protection. It embodied Japan's strategy, to strike far, fast, and first, whatever the cost. The report noted how the Betty's KASE-11 radial engines were powerful yet prone to overheating, another consequence of lightweight design. Cooling ducts were minimal, the cowlings thin. Even a small oil leak could trigger fire. To make matters worse, the crew positions were completely exposed. No armored seats, no bulletproof glass. From the nose gunner to the tail, thin aluminum separated flesh from fire. And yet, there was beauty in the design. Simplicity. Elegance. The Betty was aerodynamic in a way few bombers of the era could match. Its fuselage, shaped like a torpedo, minimized drag. Its twin-tail fins offered stability during long-range cruising. One American pilot described flying the captured Betty as surprisingly graceful. It felt light on the controls, responsive. But you couldn't shake the thought, one tracer, and you'd be gone. The Americans ran range tests over the South China Sea. With full tanks, the Betty covered nearly 3,600 kilometers, outperforming most medium bombers of the time. Its cruising efficiency astonished them. Even stripped of armament, it was clear the aircraft had been a masterpiece of fuel management. But at what cost? During flight tests, engineers noticed the smell of fuel leaking into the cabin. The tanks, they discovered, were never fully sealed. The Japanese had relied on pressure and venting rather than insulation. It was efficient, and deadly. The captured aircraft became a classroom. American crews examined its radio system, its weapon mounts, its bomb racks. They learned that many components were handcrafted, assembled with precision but little standardization. Each Betty, it seemed, carried the fingerprints of its builders. At one point, a U.S. pilot removed a small metal tag from the cockpit, etched with kanji characters reading, "Dedicated to Victory. Mitsubishi Nagoya Works, 1942. He pocketed it quietly, later saying it felt like holding a ghost. The more they learned, the more the Americans understood what the Betty truly represented. It wasn't negligence or ignorance that led Japan to build such a fragile plane. It was necessity, born from geography, strategy, and desperation. To defend an empire spread across the Pacific, Japan needed wings that could reach beyond reason. The Betty was that dream, turned against its own men. By the time the war ended, more than 2,400 G4MS had been built. Almost all were destroyed. Few survived long enough to be captured intact. Of those that remained, several were shipped to the United States for further study. One was sent to Naval Air Station Anacostia in Washington, D.C. Another to Wright Field, Ohio, for aerodynamic analysis. At Anacostia, pilots of the U.S. Navy Flight Test Division took the Betty into the air for evaluation. They marveled at its efficiency, and feared it in equal measure. The moment sunlight hit the cockpit glass, the entire plane seemed to shimmer with fragility. They concluded that no American crew would ever have accepted flying an aircraft so vulnerable. But for the Japanese, steeped in the Bushido code of sacrifice, the concept made sense. The machine was not meant to protect its pilots, it was meant to enable their mission, whatever the cost. In a confidential 1946 report, one U.S. intelligence officer summarized it bluntly: the Betty is not a bomber in the Western sense. It is a weapon of philosophy, built around the idea that survival is secondary to success. That understanding changed how post-war analysts viewed Japan's wartime engineering. It wasn't primitive, it was purposeful. A nation fighting an impossible war had built an aircraft that mirrored its own spirit, courageous, fragile, and destined to burn brightly before disappearing. In the months following Japan's surrender, the war in the Pacific faded from gunfire into silence. But for Allied intelligence teams, the study of enemy technology had only just begun. From German jets to Japanese bombers, each captured machine offered lessons, warnings written in steel and fire. And few lessons were as haunting, or as influential, as that of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty. At Wright Field, Ohio, American engineers stripped their captured Betty to its skeleton. Panels removed, engines dismantled, tanks cut open. Every rivet, every weld, every measurement was recorded. The engineers wanted to understand not just how the Betty flew, but why it failed. What choices had been made, what philosophies guided its creation, and what mistakes had cost so many lives. As they worked, one theme kept returning in their reports: weight. Every Japanese design decision came back to saving kilograms, even grams. A fraction of fuel saved meant one more mile of range. And in Japan's strategic logic, that mile could mean victory. But the Americans saw it differently. They had built bombers that could take punishment and still come home: the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and later, the B-29 Superfortress. Armor meant survival. Survival meant another mission. The Japanese had built bombers that would never come home. To Western eyes, it seemed madness. To Japan, it was duty. In post-war interviews, captured Japanese engineers explained their reasoning with calm precision. We could not produce as many aircraft as America. Therefore, every bomber had to reach farther. That was our only advantage. When asked about the lack of armor and self-sealing tanks, one Mitsubishi designer replied, "We had to choose. Weight or protection. We chose range. Armor would only let our crews die closer to home." That sentence lingered in the American analysts' minds. It wasn't ignorance. It was grim calculation. By 1946, reports from Anacostia and Wright Field circulated across Allied research divisions. The findings shocked few who had fought in the Pacific, but they transformed how aircraft design philosophy would evolve. The Betty's flaws became a blueprint for improvement. Its vulnerability taught engineers that range without protection was meaningless in modern war. Fuel capacity could not come at the cost of crew survival. In subsequent years, the U.S. Air Force began integrating lessons directly drawn from the Betty's design. One report titled Enemy Aircraft Engineering Evaluation, Type 1 Attack Bomber, noted, self-sealing fuel tanks are not optional, they are integral to operational survival. The Japanese omission demonstrates the consequences of neglecting redundancy and protection. Engineers studying the Betty's fuel system proposed modifications that later influenced early Cold War bomber development. New materials for tank sealing, composite armoring techniques, and venting systems were refined directly because of what was learned from the G4M. It was a strange legacy. The very aircraft that had destroyed itself in combat became a silent teacher in post-war laboratories. In 1947, one captured Betty at Wright Field was still operational. U.S. test pilot Lieutenant Frank T. Riley recalled the eerie sensation of flying it. It felt like a ghost. You could almost sense what those Japanese crews must have felt, the lightness, the vulnerability, the constant awareness that everything around you could ignite. He described how the cockpit's narrow glass canopy amplified the heat of the sun, how the metal skin shuddered with every gust of air. You felt like you were inside a paper lantern, he wrote later. Beautiful, but one spark and you'd be gone. The Betty taught American engineers something beyond data, it taught empathy for the enemy's burden. To fly that aircraft was to understand the courage, or perhaps the resignation, it took to go to war in one. At the same time, Japanese designers who survived the war quietly took part in rebuilding their nation's aviation industry. Under American supervision, many worked on civilian aircraft, later contributing to early post-war Mitsubishi and Nakajima, Fuji, projects. Their wartime experience, including the lessons of the Betty, would guide the rebirth of Japan's aeronautical expertise. No longer for conquest, but for commerce. Meanwhile, the Americans stored their surviving Bettys in hangars for study. Some were displayed briefly in training films for maintenance crews. Most were eventually scrapped, their lightweight frames too fragile to survive years of neglect. Only fragments would endure, a wing section at Nazim-Udvarhazy, an engine casing in a museum in Australia, and a few rusted remnants in island jungles across the Pacific. Each piece a silent reminder of the bomber that once burned its way into history. Among pilots, one observation became a sort of legend, that the Betty embodied Japan's paradox, brilliance in design, tragedy in purpose. It could fly farther than any aircraft of its class, but only once. By the early 1950s, historians began to call it the most misunderstood bomber of the war. New analyses argued that it was not poorly designed, but perfectly designed for Japan's situation, a machine optimized for an empire that could not afford mistakes, nor expect survival. Even American historians found themselves admiring its clarity of intent. The Betty was not defective, wrote one aviation scholar in 1952. It was honest. It reflected the reality of a nation fighting beyond its means. That sentiment would echo decades later. Every major air power would come to learn that no machine can balance range, armor, and speed without sacrifice. The Betty's tragedy was that Japan sacrificed the one thing it could never replace, its airmen. In lectures across U.S. flight schools in the late 1940s, instructors would display photos of burned-out Betty wrecks and write a single lesson beneath them: endurance without protection is only delay of death. The Betty had burned this truth into history, literally. The last surviving Mitsubishi G4M Betty was quietly retired in 1949. Its green paint faded, its engine seized with rust, and its once glorious wings sagged under years of dust. The warbird that had once terrified Allied fleets now sat in silence, a relic of a vanished empire, but to those who studied it, the Betty was not a relic, that it was a lesson. Carved in aluminum and lost at the Air Technical Intelligence Command, engineers compiled their final reports in cold, bureaucratic language. They Summarize the tragedy of the Betty. This aircraft demonstrates the fatal cost of overvaluing offensive range at the expense of defensive survivability. Behind those sterile words lay the graves of thousands of Japanese airmen who had never stood a chance. The report circulated across Allied nations, Britain, Australia, the United States, shaping doctrines for the Cold War. Every bomber designed in the decades to come carried echoes of that study, from the B-47 Stratojet to the B-52 Stratofortress. No aircraft would ever again be built without redundant protection systems. The fuel tank tests at Wright Field became legend among engineers, when the captured Betty's wings were filled with fuel and exposed to tracer fire. The results were horrifying. The tanks ignited instantly. Flames raced across the fuselage like a fuse wire. The entire aircraft consumed in seconds. The observers stood back, shaken. Point 1 recorded in his notebook. No ceiling, no baffles, no hope. That experiment burned more than metal. It burned away illusions that speed or range could ever substitute for survival, and yet, the Betty's spirit would outlast its destruction, not in war, but in wisdom. Among Japanese veterans, the G4M came to symbolize both their courage and their tragedy. It was the aircraft of Admiral Yamamoto's last flight. The bomber that carried him to his death over Bougainville in 1943. It was the aircraft of desperate missions, of pilots who knew they flew one way. After the war, former airmen gathered quietly in reunions, honoring their fallen comrades. Point 1 ex-pilot, Lieutenant Yoshihiro Kuroki, told a reporter, "We called her the cigarette lighter because when she was hit, she burned bright and fast, but we flew her anyway. Because we had orders, and because we believed it was enough to try." His voice trembled as he spoke, not from guilt, but from remembrance. "We didn't hate our airplane," he said softly, "we pitied it. She was beautiful, but she was born to die." In Japan's museums today, fragments of the Betty remain behind glass, pieces of fuselage, a single radial engine, a charred propeller blade. Each piece tells a story of a nation's impossible dream, and its fatal design philosophy. The Mitsubishi Historical Archives, curators preserve blueprints of the G4MS frame. On one page, hand-drawn notes in fading ink still mark the weights of every component. Margins filled with calculations, optimizations, and compromises. A reminder that war is fought not just with weapons, but with the limits of what men believe they can sacrifice. In one corner of the archive, a line written by a wartime engineer remains legible: "We built her light, because we built her for distance." Distance, that word defined Japan's strategy, and sealed its fate. When American historians later revisited the design, they understood it not as foolishness, but as desperation made mechanical. A bomber stretched beyond safety, powered by the hope that daring alone could compensate for numbers. In that sense, the Betty was not a failure, it was a mirror. It reflected the state of Japan's war: bold, brilliant, doomed. A decade after the war, in 1955, a group of American and Japanese engineers met at a symposium on aeronautical cooperation. Among them were two men who had once studied, and one who had once designed, the G4M. They shook hands, quietly acknowledging the strange bond that war had forged between them. "We learned from your bomber," one American told him. "It taught us what not to forget." The Japanese engineer bowed slightly. "Then it did not die in vain," he said. For a long moment, neither spoke again. The silence between them carried the weight of two nations' memories, and the souls of thousands who had once taken flight in fragile steel. Today, the Betty's story is rarely told outside aviation circles, but among historians and pilots, it remains one of the most haunting tales of the Pacific War. Because it asks a question that echoes across every battlefield, every decade: how much is speed worth when it costs you your life? In the end, the G4M Betty was not just an airplane. It was an idea, a symbol of how far nations will go to win, and how much they will lose by trying. And somewhere in the Pacific, deep under vines and rust, the bones of burned-out Betty still rest in the soil, silent now, but if you stand there long enough, in the humid air, you might almost hear the echo of engines long gone, the whisper of wings that once believed they could reach forever. The Betty, beautiful, doomed, and unforgettable.